Richard so clearly described, part of the challenge is concentrated in our most successful cities in the United States. And when we look at those successful cities where economic activity is growing the fastest, where we are most economically productive, we have the potential to undermine that success by encouraging, ultimately, economic segregation, and by concentrating both wealth and success, but also poverty on one hand, and in the middle of the spectrum, all of the middle American families that provide the services to our cities. It's no surprise. I think our basic economic models are going to tell us that if there is a location that allows you to be more economically productive, it is going to be more expensive to live there. If there is a location that has desirable amenities, it is going to be more expensive to live there. So in looking at that, while we can talk about it at a national or global level, what we want to do with this next panel is really focus in on the specific case of New York. What is it that we have done right and wrong in a superstar city, and what is it that we might do as we look forward? My guests on today's panel are Jonathan Bolds, Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future, Robert Hammond, co-founder and Executive Director of the Friends of the High Line, and Juliette Michaelson, Executive Vice President of the Regional Planning Association. In the interest of time, and so we can hear from the panelists, I'm going to dispense with more elaborate introductions. But Juliette, if we can begin with you, the RPA has a new comprehensive plan out. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, it'll be coming out this fall. Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Is that better? So yes, we will be releasing a regional plan this fall. It is the fourth in our region's history. So all of the trends that Richard Florida discussed nationally are accentuated here in the New York region because specifically of the factors that you just mentioned. So the region that we look at RPA extends from Trenton to New Haven. It's roughly the commuter shed of New York City. And the challenges, again, that Richard described are the same that we experience here, right? So job growth has been very, very strong in New York City. Outside New York City, the story is very different. Job growth has barely recovered from the 2008 economic recession, and poverty continues to increase, particularly, again, in the suburbs. Median incomes have dropped for everybody but the richest residents of this region. We now pay more than half of our income to housing and transportation.
Can't hear you.
Raise the
Okay.
microphone.
Ah, that's better. I'm just delivering a lot of really bad news, so. I was just saying that we spend more than half of our income on housing and transportation, right? That leaves very little for education, healthcare, retirement, college savings, et cetera. 2 million people live in communities that are experiencing rapid displacement. The economic growth that has happened in New York City has meant that there is a lot of pressure on the 5 boroughs, but also Jersey City and Hoboken for new residents wanting to move in, and of course new developments happening. Well, the old-time residents who've been there for a while are experiencing massive pressures for increased rents. Even in a lot of cases, they need to move out of those communities. And that puts a lot of strains on people's lives, but also on sort of the fabric of the communities that we have in this region. Our communities are some of the most segregated in the country. We don't always think of ourselves that way, but zoning rules, and particularly in the suburbs, school funding systems exacerbate this trend of segregation. And Sandy made it clear that storm surge was a very strong factor, a very big risk in this region. What we have been looking at more recently is just plain old sea level rise, right? So in addition to the occasional storm, which has massive implications, seas are rising each and every year. And we just released a report recently that showed that the Meadowlands will be underwater in my lifetime. That includes Giant Stadium. Every train line in New Jersey goes through the Secaucus Junction. It includes the American Dream Entertainment Complex that's just being built now. And it includes 30,000 residents and some tens of thousands of jobs as well. No one is talking about this. We commute longer than any other Americans. My commute this morning was like this. I'm sure most of you have had that experience too. And almost 1 million trips every day are taken through Penn Station and the Port Authority bus terminal that are a national disgrace. Fixing any of these things is astronomically expensive, and quite frankly, it isn't even clear that our government agencies are empowered to do anything about it. And so I told you I was going to deliver a lot of bad news. Those are really the issues that we are trying to address in the 4th Regional Plan. It will come out this fall, and it will include it will include a vision for what the region should be 25 years from now, and specify policies and specific projects that we think will be able to get us there.
So there are elements of this that relate to equity considerations. There are some that, on the other side of it, relate to economic efficiency. So Jonathan, I want to ask and make sure that folks understand, when we're talking about people's ability to locate in areas that are closer to work, that are closer to good quality schools, it's not just the equity considerations. It is also the case that where people choose to locate makes a difference to their economic productivity and to the long-term outcome for the city. Is that the case?
No question. I mean, first of all, Juliette talked a lot about the bad news, and I think that one of the real unique things about New York is that we have so many of the advantages, but a lot of those advantages, as Richard says, contributes to the real challenges that this city has, probably that are more magnified than so many other places. And so just quickly on the advantages, and some of it gets to your question, is, in the last 10 years, from March 2007 to March 2017, the finance sector, legal services, two of the traditional drivers of New York City's economy, barely created any jobs, almost totally flat in terms of employment. Yet New York City added 640,000 jobs during this time. So New York City has an advantage in that it has got an incredibly diverse economy in a way that so few cities in this country have right now. Also, it has competitive advantages in a lot of key sectors of the economy. We have about 19% of all of the securities industry workers here in New York, in the nation. We have 12% of all advertising jobs in the nation. We have 17% of music production jobs, design, fashion, architecture, tech. All of these sectors that have been growth parts of the economy have been growing in New York. We've been increasing market share. And not a lot of sectors, not a lot of cities have concentrations in those growing areas. And so obviously, all of that brings talent from around the world. One of the reasons we have all that competitive advantage is because we have the talent, but also the fact that we have so many fashion jobs and design jobs and advertising jobs brings people from all over. And we need to have housing for those people. And to be honest, not everybody working in the tech sector makes 6 figures. And so, part of the problem is that as we've seen so much growth in the economy, clearly, and you mentioned it, Sam, at the outset, that people that are getting entry-level jobs in those fields that I mentioned, making $50,000, $60,000, frankly, middle-class salaries in New York City, they can't afford to live in Manhattan, but these professionals are living in Bed-Stuy, in Crown Heights, in Rego Park, in Sunset Park, in Bay Ridge, places that used to be much more solidly low-income, moderate-income, middle-income communities. I just looked on the most recent listings for apartment rents around the city in Bed-Stuy, in Bushwick. The average one-bedroom apartment now goes for over $2,000 a month. So what we've seen is a lot of singles and couples displacing people that in apartment buildings that used to be much larger families, working poor and poor people. At the same time, I mentioned where a lot of the growth is happening in the city's economy in fields like the creative industries and tech. But frankly, in terms of raw jobs, a lot of the growth is happening in low-wage sectors. So restaurants, home health care, grocery stores, just in the last few years, added over 100,000 jobs in New York City. The average annual wage for those three industries is $26,000 or less. So, but clearly New York's not alone in having a growth in low-wage jobs. That's been growing all around the place, all around the country. But I think what's harder in New York is that because of the sky-high cost of living, when you're making a $10 an hour job, or less sometimes, that wage goes a lot less far than in a city like Charlotte or Houston. And so for folks that are working, more and more of them are working poor. We've got 400,000 people in New York City that are working, but still don't make enough to be above the poverty line. And so that's part of the kind of victim of our success that I think Richard's talking about in this book. I'd like to just add a couple of more things where I feel like we've also been a victim of our success. One is that, clearly all these neighborhoods I mentioned that used to be more middle class, working class neighborhoods have been displaced. We're seeing displacement. But also on the commercial side, a lot of the companies in tech and creative industries that can no longer afford rents in Midtown Manhattan, downtown Manhattan, they're going into the boroughs. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we've seen is that we've seen displacement in some of the blue-collar industries that used to be in those areas. So that's further magnifying the problem. Also, we've got such a talent surplus in this city. Also, kind of one of the advantages, we have so much talent, but that means that you have people with college degrees working at the Apple store here. And you have people that are applying for jobs that don't necessarily need a college degree because the jobs don't require one, but they're going to people with college degrees anyway because we have such a surplus of talent here. And just the last thing on all that, again, kind of more to the victim of our success, is that I think because so many of our top employers in this city know they can rely on the best and the brightest from across the country and around the world, we don't see the same level of those employers embracing community colleges the way they do in other places. We don't need the local talent here as much as for some of these growth industries the way they do in a place like North Carolina, where they really are investing in their community college system in a big way. Same thing about internships. I think we haven't seen major employers investing in local internships to bring up the local talent the way we have in some of those other cities, in part because they have so much, they have the pick of the litter to choose from for those jobs. So those are a few things that I think are concerning.
So when you talk about our being victims of our own success, clearly for all of the challenges, whether it be the quality of the subway system, the difficulty in getting around, the cost of living here, people still choose to locate here because you are either more economically productive by virtue of your location, or there are highly desirable amenities that prove to be attractive, whether it be schools, as you mentioned, with school funding, or location amenity. And Robert, I want to turn to you with this. You recently were quoted in City Lab as saying, "We failed to design a park that benefited neighborhoods." What did you mean?
Yeah, City Lab misquoted me, Richard, and it's funny because I went back to the writer and actually made her replay the tape. And what I said is that we failed in our outreach to low-income residents. So one, I think the High Line is a success. There is issues around it, but I think we made two things that I would do differently. One, we did an incredible amount of outreach. We have next to the High Line, we have two large low-income NYCHA housing projects. When we were doing that, 70% of the kids were on a lunch program in that neighborhood. And so we did about 8 years worth of community input. We had our offices were there in NYCHA for several years, and we did a lot of community input sessions. But when we opened, they didn't come. And so all of that work, I'm glad we did it, but it wasn't successful in making them feel ownership. Now, there was a lot of ownership from a lot of other people in New York. I think the High Line is an example of we're a textbook of the creative class in some ways. That's who helped support the High Line. And so we realized we had a problem. So we went and interviewed 20% of the people that lived in NYCHA there. And what they said is, they didn't hate the High Line, which is what I was sort of scared of. They said, it wasn't built for us, we don't see people that look like us, and we don't like your programs. And so we realized we had to do something different. So we sort of revamped all of our programs. We focus really solely on New Yorkers and underserved in our own neighborhood. We do over 400 free programs. And then the thing they said they wanted the most was jobs. So we created a job program for teens, expanding that into an internship, sort of using our influence in the neighborhood to getting people. The hotels that work in the neighborhood, I know 2 of them do not employ 1 person in the neighborhood. And so working to how can the economic growth that's coming to the neighborhood benefiting some of the people there. And then the other mistake, or the other thing we did differently, is once you create value, it's very hard to take it back. Now, then the High Line was so risky, it was a hard proposition to say we're going to create a lot of value, let's carve more of it out for low-income housing. But that's where we're working with other industrial, we started something called the High Line Network, working with other industrial reuse projects they don't have to make that mistake. And you can only do it before you create the value, and there's some great examples of public space projects doing that. The 11th Street Bridge in Washington, they haven't even built it yet. They raised $40 million for a land trust. So there's a lot of things, I think we help make the crazy credible, and now we need to sort of hold people to task that you can't wait until you're done building these things to look at these issues. I mean, there are things you can do afterwards that we're doing, but you're going to be much more successful if you do those things up front.
Juliette, with that in mind, what elements of the plan that we'll see this fall are designed to address issues of economic opportunity and inclusion?
A lot of them, actually. That has been a singular focus of ours. When we started this regional planning process 4 years ago, thank you, the first thing we did was conduct focus groups of residents who lived around the region, and just to ask them how they experience their communities, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And unilaterally, the messages were, like you were saying, people like living here. It's good for economic opportunity. They find good jobs, well-paying jobs. But it is difficult to live here, and it is expensive to live here. And people always feel like, one quote was, like Suffolk County is the new Nassau County. People are just always being pushed farther and farther and farther from the core. Their commutes are getting longer. And this is the displacement that I was talking about before. We, by the way, have a report that came out a few weeks ago called Pushed Out. It's a terrific report where we quantify this phenomenon and also have interviewed people who've experienced this displacement. So it's a tricky situation because, of course, we want the economic growth, but it has to be distributed more evenly. It can't just be concentrated in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Jersey City, Hoboken. There are an awful lot of places like Newark, Patterson, Bridgeport, Norwalk that need the jobs, right? And those are places that used to be bigger than they are today. They have the infrastructure. They are on train lines. So one thing is to promote to just take care of those places and promote job growth in those places. That, of course, has a transportation, investment component, but other things as well, job training, like you were mentioning. Promote more housing construction to meet regional level demand. In fact, we think that there is demand. There are so many people who want to live in this region that we could increase housing production by 50%. That has a benefit region-wide. It also, however, has implications on a neighborhood level, right? It is disruptive, like I was saying earlier, for communities to see big towers going up, and most of the time, those are market rate and wealthier people moving in. So we're promoting multi-development, more multi-development construction, more rental construction everywhere, particularly near transit hubs. At the same time that this is happening, protecting the people who live in those neighborhoods, who are long-time residents of those neighborhoods, is critically important. And more than that, actually, we should make sure that they benefit from the change, right? So this could translate into better neighborhood amenities as the development comes in, better tenant protection measures, anti-harassment legislations, more fair schooling mechanisms to reduce disparities in opportunity. Rob Hammond, you just mentioned employing people from the neighborhood to promote some of these investments. All of those things can help to make sure that the neighborhoods that are changing are also benefiting from that change. And then the last thing I would say that is important not to forget is to build more affordable housing, and not just in the communities where people have lower incomes, but even in communities that are wealthier, that have better schools, that have better transit access. They also need to carry their fair share of affordable housing.
So we've got housing issues, we've got issues around education infrastructure, transportation infrastructure in our most successful cities. And Jonathan, when I'm visiting other parts of the country or the world, there are other great cities like New York that are extremely successful, where we see meaningful growth, increasing job diversity. But when we look at issues around school funding, investment in infrastructure, very often they're doing a better job than we are. On both the success and challenge side, how idiosyncratic are New York's issues, and how common are they elsewhere?
Wow. I think Errol should probably handle that as the kind of political expert in the room. But, I think that there's a lot of things that New York does better than others. I think that the kind of civic leadership here is stronger than most places. I think the nonprofit infrastructure we have here is particularly strong, and you don't find that elsewhere. You don't find the same level of intermediaries there to help small businesses or neighborhood entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of things that New York has going for it. I think that a lot of people say that despite the problems at the MTA and other places, there's a maturity and an experience here that we don't have other places. Building affordable housing, no other city has the track record and leadership and kind of know-how as we have here in New York. But there's still so much of a gap. And you mentioned education, and I'll just say that so many of the things that I talked about and that Richard talks about in his book, I think the solution has to be about education, and a lot of it is not the kind of thing you can just snap your fingers and solve. One example is that New York has some of the most highly educated people in the world. The Upper West Side of Manhattan, 81% of adults have a college degree. In Brownsville, 8%. So, and I think in part, this kind of a lot of times New York is doing so well because we have that 81% that sometimes you forget that we have the 8% also. In New York State, talking about politically, for 15, 20 years, all of the conversation from an economic point of view has been helping the upstate economy. And I get it. It makes total sense given the kind of economic frustration and dislocation and stagnation that's happened up there. But for a lot of that time, the Bronx has had the highest unemployment rate in all of New York State, of all the counties. But we don't often see the kind of political response beyond New York City to the specific problems that we have here. And there's a lot of them. And so getting that kind of a path to a middle class really runs through education. We've seen this Mayor de Blasio, invest in the early side with universal pre-K. I think that there needs to be a little bit more on the later side. We've done a lot of research about community colleges, the importance of community colleges as platforms for mobility. Right now, more people are enrolling in those community colleges, but not a lot of people are actually staying in and graduating. At Ostos Community College in the Bronx, for instance, only 26% of those that enroll graduate in 6 years. And this is for a 2-year degree. There's a lot of other problems. There's some great solutions that are going on. We have some excellent workforce development programs that are geared towards helping people get into that pipeline to the tech sector, but they are at such a small scale. Great programs like Perscolas and Access Code and the city's tech talent pipeline, are either serving a few dozen or a few hundred people a year. We've got to figure out how do we scale up those things that work in New York City. I don't think that other cities necessarily do it better, but that's a big challenge for New York going forward. I think that we should get to some of those solutions.
So in just a moment, we're going to open it up to questions. Before we do that, a question really for everyone on the panel. Rob, you mentioned NYCHA and wanting to be able to engage with and work with folks who are living in the area of the High Line, that we also then face issues of displacement. What I'm wondering about is sort of that, area median income. That middle income family that may not have the benefit of access to affordable housing or rent control. What is the solution when we introduce amenities to a neighborhood that are going to make it more expensive to live there, but there are no formal policy mechanisms for controlling the cost of housing? It's going to get bid up. What do we do?
I mean, I'll throw out the unpopular, in my neighborhood even, is density. I mean, we have to build more. It's not going to happen without building more. And so, I mean, it's not, setting aside affordable housing is not going to answer it if we don't build more. How many people want to move to New York? 1 million people are going to move in what time period? 10, 20 years? You build out every single a lot that is available to build, you're not going to fit them. So that's going to drive up everybody's rent, and so that's going to be our challenge. And you're seeing how hard it is, with the mayor now dealing, because people don't want the density in their neighborhood.
What is the biggest practical challenge in increasing density? Is it NIMBY?
Clearly, I mean, look at you've seen what seems like a very sensible affordable housing plan, rezonings that are happening in a handful of neighborhoods to create more density in places that arguably badly need more affordable housing, but it's been a real problem. There's been a lot of people understandably feeling that, people feeling that they're going to be displaced for whatever happens. In other neighborhoods, you've got a different kind of NIMBY going on. You've got a feeling that we don't want to see more housing in this community because we don't have the infrastructure to sustain it. And a lot of people feel like more people coming in, the quality of life will go down, but especially without enough schools, without enough transit, without enough parking spaces for some neighborhoods. So a lot of those things have to happen together.
Yeah, I think the trouble is that we're trying, we may all be very well-meaning, right? We are all doing this for the right reasons, but we're doing this on the back of decades of poor urban policy, let's face it, and urban policy that has disfavored a lot of people who are feeling very burned by that, and the lack of trust that has developed over the last 75 years is just very, very difficult to overcome. That has traditionally been racial and ethnically tinged mistrust. Now, of course, now there's the 99%, 1% mistrust. So add those two and you get a party. I mean, it's just very easy to turn down projects because people don't believe that change is going to benefit them. And that's really the narrative, I think, that we're going to have to change.
I just want to make a personal plug, too. I produced a movie on Jane Jacobs that's came out last week. And, it's interesting because for some, she's this patron saint of NIMBYism, the patron saint of not building top-down affordable housing. This would be the kind of panel she would hate, or experts. But I think there is a real lesson in her, and to me, it's not just about stoops or preservation. That's not her message to me. Her message is in the messiness of the city. It is an organism, and you need to sort of empower the people to help come up with their own solutions. And there is not one solution. I mean, I threw out, more density, but it's about that messiness and sort of the organic and letting those sort of solutions come up. So the plug. It's playing at IFC. It did really well last weekend. It's held over for one more week. Opening in 20 cities this weekend. Please see it.
Citizen Jane Battle for the City. Excellent. Questions? Sir. Let me grab a microphone.
No, I don't need the mic. It's recorded. Oh, I'm so sorry. I need the mic. My question is the privileging of policy, the elevation of policymakers over the actual population. You had stated, I'm sorry, I missed your name, but you had stated that there is this resistance, implied, or I understood it as implying, that there's a resistance on the part of the population to these top-down decision-making. And there's top-down that are elected, Highline, the Barry Dillers, and Dan Van Fustenberg, still top-down telling us how we should live and how best. So there's a great deal of resistance to that. I see it as a dead end. Perhaps I'm being pessimistic. How do you persuade someone like me who has an inherent distrust of any top-down, I'm going to improve your life, I'm going to make your life better, more comfortable. Thank you.
Well, I'll take, now the High Line is so successful, it looks top down. I mean, Barry Diller gave money at the end, but we fought for it. It was me and another community resident for 8 years, sued City Hall and then partnered with the Bloomberg administration. So it is something that the top did not want. Giuliani and 3 mayors before it fought against it. The irony is the developers in the neighborhood fought against it. And so it was a community project. Now it's so successful and it is, well funded, so it sort of has a different feeling to it. But
We'll squeeze in 1 or 2 more questions before we run out of time, please.
Is this on? Cool. Thanks for being here. My name is Pete Harrison, and I have a housing startup called Homebody. I guess my question is for everybody, but generally through the lens of the High Line. You talked about value capture earlier. Obviously, with the amount of economic development and the amount of sort of explosive growth in certain aspects of the economy, like how would New York City, what are your ideas to capture that value? And specifically, what would you have done differently for the High Line to capture some of that surrounding development value?
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that could have been done. Manhattan is particularly hard because the values, even when the High Line was being built, were so high. So you could never do stuff like land trust. Land trust could work in places like the Bronx potentially. There were incentives when we did the zoning. It was the affordable housing was 28% was set aside for affordable housing, but more condos got built, so that number went down. You could have put structured things in the zoning that when you transfer the air rights, money has to go into a pool for affordable housing. That wasn't done because the project was thought to be so risky that people thought that wouldn't fly. Now, if you know you're creating value, you can structure more. And we have a list of 10 of these different ways in each neighborhood. It very much depends on the neighborhood, but ways of capturing that value. So happy to share it.
I apologize, I'm getting the signal that we have to wrap it up, but please join me in thanking our panelists, Juliette, Jonathan, and Rob. As we close, just 2 quick things. I first want to thank everyone involved in making today's program possible. Richard for making the trip, our panelists, and Errol, Stephen, the amazing director of our urban lab, and of course our events team, Jessica Estrada-Watson, Catherine Green. If you're able to stick around for a bit, Richard's book is available here. He'll also be doing a book signing, and I'll turn it back over to Stephen.
Sam wrapped it up for me. Thank you for coming. Take care.